he can get away with that nonsense, lying about the economy, lying about social issues, lying about his attempt to effectively use the military to control American streets, which is where he's heading. But he can't necessarily lie about Epstein. The thing about Trump is Trump probably is beyond accountability to the mainstream media. He's not beyond accountability to those people who've bought into the lies for so long. And we're at the point of the demented Wizard of Oz moment. That if those supporters pull the curtain back on Trump and see simply a relatively tiny man who has made himself look big by simply spinning taller and taller tales, if they pull that curtain back and see that tiny man and call him out on it, that will be a very difficult moment for the Donald.
Hello, I'm Fergus Macphee and welcome to the Trump Report on Times Radio. A reminder, you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on our YouTube channel, and you can also listen and follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today, once again, I'm delighted to say, is Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the Clinton Institute, University of Dublin. Scott, we always love talking to you on the Trump Report. How are you doing this morning?
Well, I need to apologize to you and the viewers because of the music festival that was really good and it cold. I now sound like the a bad impersonation of Darth Vader. You know, Donald, I am your father. You know, so y'all gonna have to put up with that, I'm afraid.
Well, we're going to be putting that voice to the test because we do have quite a busy show, and we'll get straight into the Epstein files. I mean, they are back in the news this morning because last night the House committee released over 33,000 pages related to the convicted sex offender. But the Democrats this morning have been quick to pour cold water on the development, saying that 97%, I think, of this information was already in the public domain. Scott, is there anything new in the files that were released last night?
I haven't been through all the files yet. I tried my hardest, haven't been through it. But, I haven't seen anything that is new out of the files. I've seen very little that hasn't been made public already. And other news outlets who've been going over this other night have not come up with anything that's significant out of it. Now, maybe there's something that's hidden away from all of us that will emerge. But at this point, I think we can state a couple of working, as it were, ideas about this. The first is that the material, by and large, that has come out is filings from courts. Now, those are often made public anyway. There's video surveillance of both the execution of the warrant on Jeffrey Epstein's premises and some video surveillance, on his cell. But it's not just Democrats pouring scorn that there's anything new here. It's also the relatives of those who were abused by Jeffrey Epstein, and in some cases those who were abused by Epstein. They will be having a press conference later today to put their story forward. And it's also those Republicans in the House who were demanding the release of all of the files. There are 11 of them. And the timing here is what's the interesting point, Fergus, because if there was no move by the Trump people, those Republicans were going to push for a vote in the House demanding the release of all of the files. And you might say, well, it's only 11 Republicans, but they have a very slim majority. So if all the Democrats join them, then you've got this legislative pressure, on the Trump folks to put up or shut up. So they tried to push it back with this while trying to go to the individual 11 Republicans and say, we've given you enough now. Now, the thing to watch is Thomas Massie, who's the leader of that 11 Republicans, has already said he's not satisfied with it. Will the others say the same thing? So what's happened here is I think they had to make a move, but it is a real gamble because they may be caught in nowhere's land here. No man's land. On the one hand, they have released the files, which bring them back into the headlines. And the story had receded in the past couple of weeks. But on the other hand, there's nothing new in the files, which means they look bad. We are back into the legislative period. It's after Labor Day, which was on Monday. But if Epstein comes in and takes over the news cycle again, amidst all the Trump craziness, that's just simply not good for him. It's not good for him, and it's not good for for his insiders who are trying to pretend like they have this authority and are being questioned by their own base.
Yeah, it does seem that bringing it up like this with, a host of files, which, like we said, 97% are already in the public domain, that kind of just seems to add to the speculation and the sort of internet rumors that this is all a cover-up, drip feeding this information.
Yeah, I'm not one to hang out with a conspiracy theorist, especially when they're conspiracy theorists who are MAGA conspiracy theorists. But, the fundamentals are this, and that is that, Donald Trump has been identified in public documents. He's been identified in photographs, of being a pal of Jeffrey Epstein. Now, he claims he broke ties with Epstein, and I think that's probably true because of their fight over a real estate deal about 20 years ago. But, what happened before that break is still a subject, as you mentioned, of speculation. What's there beyond what we know?
And you mentioned the possible vote in the House. I think Thomas Massey is sort of leading from the Republican side. Is it right Ro Khanna is sort of leading from the Democrat side? Constitutionally, I guess I want to ask, what has to happen for that vote to take place? And then how likely is it to pass?
Well, you have to have it, a debate which is tabled, which is scheduled, and the Republican leadership and the Republicans control that could try to hold out against that, but they just look increasingly bad if they don't allow a full debate on this. Now, Mike Johnson, who's the House Speaker, came out yesterday and said, that's it, everything's put to bed now, you've got your files, go away, and Massey didn't accept that. Now, how much, pull does Johnson have with the large majority of Republicans in the House? And, we have to consider what happens in the Senate as well. But at this point, I think the biggest question is how much of Donald Trump's supporters, how many of those supporters just aren't satisfied? Because that'll just put pressure on Republican representatives wherever they stand on the issue at the moment.
Yeah, and as you say, we'll be eagerly watching that press conference later today from, I think, around 100 of Epstein's victims. We're talking a few hours before it takes place. But we'll move on, because meanwhile this morning we've seen Vladimir Putin meeting and looking incredibly friendly with Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un at China's military victory parade. It's the first time that all three have ever appeared publicly together. It appeared to be kind of a united front against the West. Donald Trump took to Truth Social to say, please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America. Is his relationship with Putin in tatters?
No, his relationship with Putin's on strings. And that is, Vlad pulls them, and can he make Donald dance? Now, we've known that, and I've discussed that with you and with other good folks at Times Radio. But let's get to the heart of where we are right now, and taking two aspects. First of all, let's deal with the headlines about Putin and Xi and Kim. Putin's being very friendly because Putin needs friends. And he is not winning in Ukraine. I'm going to repeat this and wait for all the trolls to come in on the YouTube channel. Say, oh, no, we're conquering everything. The quick reminder, November 2022, Putin and Russia had 18% of Ukraine under Russian occupation. Almost 3 years later, they have 19% of Ukraine under Russian occupation. They've taken 1% of Ukrainian territory in almost 3 years. At this rate of advance, it's going to be 2265 before they conquer all of Ukraine. They've put a lot of resources in there. They put a lot of men in there. You're talking well over 1 million casualties. If they are winning, the fundamental we start off with is, well, why do they need all of this Chinese support? And they're getting a lot of Chinese support, not necessarily directly through the government, but through Chinese companies that are connected to the government. That's how the Chinese funnel in military support. And more importantly, China buying Russian oil at a discount, which props up the Russian economy. And if Putin is winning, why does he need those 12,000 North Korean troops that he brought in last autumn? Because Russia lost part of its territory to Ukraine. And why does he reportedly, according to South Korean intelligence, need another 6,000 North Korean troops for going across there very soon? Why does he need all the North Korean rockets, the North Korean munitions, North Korean artillery, North Korean missiles? So Putin has needed this, and he's under increasing pressure. He's under increasing pressure because Ukraine's counterattacking. They are hitting key Russian installations. I mean, it's almost every day now I'm reporting on an oil refinery, sometimes multiple oil refineries that have been hit, rail lines, railway terminuses, engineering plants, logistic plants. It isn't, Ukraine's not going to knock him out of the war. It's not going to stop the invasion by doing this, but they're constraining what he can do, right? And the Russian economy is flatlining. GDP is now stagnant. Inflation continues to run quite high. There's a risk it could go higher because Russia has dropped interest rates slightly. They had been over 20%. So you got the combination threat of inflation plus recession at the same time. So he goes to this high-profile event. It was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now it's the Chinese military parade. And it's like he's got these best buddies here. But meanwhile, let's expand this. North Korea is not exactly in great shape either. Not exactly a flourishing global power in terms of its economic presence. They did have a significant increase in their economy, relatively speaking, last year. But that's because of Russia. That was because they were selling all this equipment up to Russia that came in there. So you got Putin and Kim, and they're like two one-legged guys who are leaning each other, on the street trying to stand upright. And then you got Xi behind them going, hey, I'll give you a lift. And China will give them a lift. Now, why is China going to give them a lift? They're getting cheap Russian oil because they're getting a big discount on the Russian oil. The big news, if you go into details yesterday, is they've revived the idea of the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, this big pipeline from Russia to China. Now, that had been put on hold because they could not agree on pricing. They couldn't agree on who was the cost share of construction, and they couldn't agree on the price of the gas through the pipeline. Now, if China's probably demanded tougher terms from the Russians and said, look, you got to accept our terms now. And Russia said, okay, yeah, we'll do it. Now, they did not announce the terms yesterday, but we'll keep an eye on that. And meanwhile, of course, North Korea, wants China not to side with others who have constrained the North Korean economy and put sanctions on it. They want to stick it. So I don't want to diminish the significance of this in terms of that China is extremely important here. But to say that this is like an alliance that's going to take over the world, blah, 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 that it fundamentally changes things, no, it doesn't. And we can put that in the wider context of Ukraine. Hopefully, we chat soon. But just to get back to Trump very quickly, for the sake of time. Look, Trump's just simply twisting in the wind. He comes out, you just read that bizarre post on Truth Social, which is, say hi to my friend Vlad. And by the way, y'all are engaged in a conspiracy. And it's like, okay, make up your mind, dude. I mean, you can't send a friendly greeting card and then say, oh, you bad guys. And the fact here is that what is important is not what Trump thinks of, does Vlad like me today? Does Kim like me today? Does she like me today? It's what's happening within the U.S. bureaucracy. And the fact here is that the U.S. is advancing, or I should say U.S. officials are advancing with Ukraine and Europe in terms of military assistance, in terms of discussions about security guarantees, and I think importantly, because it was overshadowed by this, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, who's one of the senior members of the Trump cabinet, came out 2 days ago on Fox, and he said, look, sanctions are back on the table, because Russia won't stop attacking Ukrainian civilians. And this is after Trump had let his 50-day deadline lapse because he wanted to play nice with Vlad in Alaska.
So I guess my question around it is, it's very easy to say that, this showing was kind of a united front against the West, and maybe extrapolate that and say it was a front against Trump because of how he's dealt with the countries. But are you sort of saying actually what we saw was more of a meeting of circumstance between sort of North Korea, China, and Russia?
It's a meeting. It's a meeting for the cameras, first of all. It's symbolism, and then politically, it's a meeting of maneuver. Now, let's put this some way. I mean, in some way, Trump has driven these folks together, or at least it's encouraged China to roll the car up between these two guys on the street and say, hop on in. And that's because of the tariff threat. You might remember that Trump at one point, I think he was over 200%, 245% at one point. Now, that's come down because the U.S. and China are in these protracted talks about where the tariff levels are going to land. But you will also remember that Trump was trying to bully China. Yeah, take my deal, take my deal, take my deal. And China said, well, screw you. No, we're not taking your deal. And while they get into the negotiations with Trump, then it's like, okay, we don't necessarily need to deal with you. We can go to others and exert what we're trying to do, right? And I think that's important. I'll go beyond China to explain why it's important. Where the U.S. has really screwed up is with India. Really messed up with India, big time. There was a trade deal that was very close to being signed, and Trump kicked it back and said, nah, I don't like that. Open up their entire agricultural market. And he got really upset that India would not bow down and say, thank you for ending our clashes with Pakistan in April. Because Pakistan, oh, you're wonderful, you can have the Nobel Peace Prize. India wouldn't do it. Trump gets pissed off, and so he slaps 50% tariffs on India, including 25% of that 50 is because they buy oil from Russia. Now, India's really, really upset about that because he didn't put tariffs on China for buying oil from Russia. So who else shows up for Shanghai Cooperation Organization? And who is smiling and shaking Putin's hand, shaking Xi's hand? Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister. So, you will have these countries that if the U.S. continues to try to punish them, they will say we'll maneuver so that our economic and political dealings are with each other. But that's not a lasting relationship. And by the way, first person that comes in on our YouTube comments and goes, BRICS, 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 ding, 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 you win a prize. Because BRICS is like the biggest jumped up, basically, PR exercise in that those countries do not get along with each other at times. And so, yeah, enemy of my friend for the moment, but it doesn't fundamentally change geopolitics for the next 30 years.
No, but from where I'm sitting, I mean, that relationship with Modi, I was going to ask about it. If you believe some of the things that have been written, he's not even taking Donald Trump's calls at the moment. He's screening them. It almost seems like a clash of egos, but one that potentially has huge geopolitical consequences.
Well, I mean, I work with Indian television, and I did a lot of work with them last couple of weeks when the tariffs were introduced and now taking effect. And the Indian TV stations, quite often, they're not like run by the government, but they tap into what the government says. Man, they are really ticked off. And I mean, and it's not just for show. They are genuinely ticked off as to why they're getting it in the neck from Trump. And Modi is a man who is a proud man. He is a bully in his own right while trying to pretend like, I'm a world leader. And it's just this weird thing that because Trump didn't get fluffed by the Indians over that war that he did not solve. There were a lot of people that pushed India and Pakistan back. That he just has decided he takes some side. And there's also a very dangerous official within the Trump administration, I should say, that's beyond this, and that's Peter Navarro. I mean, Peter Navarro, who is an economist with no economic qualifications in terms of like talking economic sense, and I'll say that. Is Navarro hates China, and he's been someone who has always said tariffs on China, tariffs on China. But in recent weeks and months, he really has gone after India as well. And he's the one that came up and said, like, this is a death economy, right? A dead economy. Like the Chinese, you mentioned how the Indians took that. And just a quick reminder for your viewers, how important is this? India is part of the Quad. India is part of the Quad, which along with Australia and along with Japan, is there with the United States in terms of a political and military relationship, in part as a counterweight to who? China. Well, Trump is basically risking all of that simply because he's decided to get into, an ego fight with Modi.
Mm. We'll end with the news that rumours of the president's death have been greatly exaggerated, I think, Scott. Why did the internet for 48 hours think that Donald Trump was dead?
Yeah, well, first of all, it has happened before because that quote is from Mark Twain, who I adore, right? And I'd love to have Mark Twain around also to issue some other quotes about Donald Trump because he didn't suffer fools gladly. But I'll try to fill in for Mark here and say, look, people get invested in the spectacle of news. And, the idea that someone is at death's door will tend to be, a spectacle, kind of a grim spectacle in any case. And then you just get the acceleration of social media, which is out there. And the whole point about social media is that it moves so quickly and that, it gets amplified that people don't take time to check where they are on the facts. Now, so let's set out where exactly. Look, he's got varicose veins. It's a really, really mundane story that he's got varicose veins, because that's what became the discolored hands story. Varicose veins can cause the discoloring of the hands. It also causes, cankles. The legs can get swollen, and that's been around for some time. But then he just simply he wasn't shouting every day. It was just as simple as that he wasn't shouting, because we'd gotten used to Trump popping up to sign some whacked out executive order, like to make chocolate milk illegal because it's woke or something like that. And then he didn't do it for a couple of days, and the press has gotten, and this is a serious story beyond what we're talking about. The mainstream press, I'm not talking about the alternatives, the mainstream press has gotten so dependent on this drip feed from Trump that if they don't get their news high or news low from where I'm looking at each day, they start to get the jitters. They start to get withdrawal from it. And it was that he almost always cuts loose on a Friday. And there was one Friday where it's where's Donald? He isn't showing up to go to Mar-a-Lago or to Bedminster, New Jersey. He's not giving us some whacked out crazy lines. And that's what kicked it all off. Now, I don't want to, I will say this just to give you a stinger here. I think he's mentally diminished. Now, I will say this emphasizing that I am not a physician.
Yeah. Do you have any evidence for
Let
that?
me explain why I think he's mentally diminished, and I'll talk about this, or I'll explain this maybe in a way which is, if not mentally diminished, the filters are completely off. Trump is a compulsive liar. That we know, right? But what Trump is doing now is Trump is lying so incredibly blatantly that it actually doesn't make sense. And the one that came out yesterday was when he said, we've got an investment of $17 trillion into the United States. I've gotten $17 trillion. The entire U.S. GDP is around about $35 trillion. That's the entire GDP. He's saying he's gotten 50% of U.S. GDP in the last few weeks, last few months. Now, that's just absolute nonsense, right? But at this point, Trump just simply makes up numbers or makes up details, and he's doing it much more rapidly than he used to. He's always done this crap about, I met a guy who said, or my friend said, and it's okay, that's the one who's living in your head, mate, right? He's just doing his attitude. And so actually, I'll back off a little bit and say, okay, maybe he's not mentally diminished, but the other alternative is this. He doesn't care how the media react now. He knows that he can say almost any absolute nonsense, and he's beyond accountability for it. So he just doesn't care. But to bring this all the way back around to where we started, he can get away with that nonsense, lying about the economy, lying about social issues, lying about his attempt to effectively use the military to control American streets, which is where he's heading. But he can't necessarily lie about Epstein. The thing about Trump is Trump probably is beyond accountability to the mainstream media. He's not beyond accountability to those people who've bought into the lies for so long. And we're at the point of the demented Wizard of Oz moment. That if those supporters pull the curtain back on Trump and see simply a relatively tiny man who has made himself look big by simply spinning taller and taller tales, if they pull that curtain back and see that tiny man and call him out on it, that will be a very difficult moment for the Donald.
Well, Scott, we will be watching that press conference today later, and I'm sure Times Radio will be back with some more Trump reports with the findings. But for now, thank you so much for joining us on today's show.
Thanks to you and all the great viewers out there.